Ethan Carter had always cherished the quiet dignity of suburban life. A decorated military veteran and now a city official, he spent his days balancing his responsibilities at the municipal planning office with his passion for restoring classic cars. A hobby that not only fueled his creative spark, but also gave him an excuse to escape into his private haven. His home, a modest yet lovingly maintained colonial tucked away on a tree-lined street, was his sanctuary. Every detail, from the manicured garden to the hand-painted shutters, spoke to a life of care, honor, and personal history. But in every story of peace, there's always a crack waiting to widen. For Ethan, that crack came in the form of Kerren, the self-appointed and self-righteous president of the local homeowners association, HOA. Known around the neighborhood as HOA Kerren, she had built her reputation on enforcing a strict, often arbitrary, set of rules that dictated everything from the shade of permissible porch paint to the length of hedges. Kerren's office was a tiny annex near the community center, from where she ruled with an iron fist and an ever-present smirk. On a crisp autumn morning, as the golden sunlight danced across Ethan's well-tended lawn, an ominous knock at the door shattered the morning calm. Standing on his doorstep was Kerren herself, clipboard in hand and a look that blended self-importance with smug entitlement. "Mr. Carter," she began in a tone that brooked no argument, "I'm afraid your property is in violation of several community guidelines." Ethan listened with the steady composure that had seen him through tougher days in uniform. He had always prided himself on being respectful and law-abiding, but he also believed in fairness and the rule of law, not the whims of an entitled few. Kerren's accusation was as vague as it was unfounded, something about unauthorized modifications and a breach of aesthetic decorum. In her eyes, even the personal touches Ethan added to his home, a quirky garden sculpture here, a bespoke light fixture there, were a challenge to the rigid uniformity she so prized. "You must understand," she continued, "that this isn't personal. It's about preserving the community's standards." For Ethan, however, it felt deeply personal. This was his sanctuary, his hard-won refuge after years of sacrifice, now being dictated by someone who'd never had to fight for anything in her life. The confrontation quickly escalated into a battle of principles. Ethan calmly explained that his property enhancements were fully compliant with local zoning laws, and that the HOA's own guidelines were ambiguous at best. Kerren's eyes narrowed, and her smile faded into a stern line as she reiterated, "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Carter." The air grew tense, the early morning quiet shattered by the collision of two very different worldviews. One built on respect for individual liberty, and another on the unyielding enforcement of outdated rules. As Ethan closed the door on that uncomfortable visit, his mind churned with a mix of disbelief and indignation. How could a group entrusted with protecting the community's interests become a tool for personal vendettas and petty control? The seeds of conflict had been sown that day, a silent promise that Ethan would not be bullied into submission. Every inch of his property, every carefully chosen detail, stood as a testament to his hard work and dedication. And now it was being challenged by a force that cared more about appearances than substance. In the days that followed, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly nods now whispered about the new wave of fines and sanctions that had begun to ripple through the community. It wasn't just about curb appeal. It was about power, control, and the audacity to decide who got to call a place home. And at the center of it all was Kerren, a woman whose very name had become synonymous with arbitrary rules and unaccountable authority. That first confrontation marked a turning point for Ethan. No longer would he allow his peaceful retreat to be trampled by bureaucratic overreach. His mind was set. If Kerren and her cronies wanted a fight, they'd have one. The battle lines were drawn, not between neighbors, but between principle and tyranny. And as the leaves turned from green to gold, Ethan prepared himself for the long, arduous struggle ahead. His home, his freedom, and the very idea of community were at stake, and he was determined to protect them at all costs. The very next day, Ethan awoke to a sight that made his heart sink, a crisp envelope, ominously taped to his front door. Inside lay a $750 fine, a final warning for a supposed violation that Ethan knew all too well had never existed. The fine was couched in legalese, its content designed to intimidate and coerce, a message not only to Ethan, but to every homeowner daring to express a modicum of individuality. Outside, on the front lawn, Kerren stood like a statue of authority, arms folded and eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. She seemed to relish the moment. "The rules are clear, Mr. Carter," she declared, her voice steady and imbued with a superiority that bordered on arrogance. "You have been duly notified. Compliance is not optional." Her tone left no room for discussion, only for submission. But Ethan was not so easily cowed. A lifetime of service had taught him the value of due process, and he was well aware that the HOA's fine was not only baseless, it was illegal. With the calm determination of someone who'd faced far worse in his military days, he collected the fine and made his way to his home office. There, he pored over local zoning laws and property rights, finding ample evidence to refute the HOA's flimsy claims. That afternoon, with legal documents neatly organized and highlighted, Ethan marched down to the HOA office. There, he formally filed complaint with the local zoning office, citing the arbitrary nature of the fine. His voice was firm, his arguments clear. The HOA had no authority to enforce rules that were never democratically approved by the community. Yet even as he presented his case, Kerren maintained her haughty stance. "Rules apply equally," she insisted, though the sharp glint in her eye suggested she knew better. It wasn't long before the backlash began. Anonymous complaints trickled in about Ethan's property, a desperate ploy orchestrated by Kerren to muddy the waters of his legitimacy. Soon, local inspectors began arriving unannounced, armed with clipboards and a relentless determination to find any supposed infraction. Each visit felt like an intrusion, a reminder that Kerren was pulling every string available to disrupt Ethan's life. At every turn, Kerren's actions bordered on theatrical. She would be seen conversing with inspectors, her tone dripping with smug satisfaction, as if she were the lone guardian of community standards. Neighbors started noticing the tension, whispering about the disproportionate measures being taken against Ethan, a man who had always been a model citizen. Yet, many were too intimidated by the HOA's reputation to speak out openly. As the days wore on, the conflict grew ever more acrimonious. Ethan continued to compile evidence, meticulously documenting every visit from inspectors and every baseless complaint that was filed. He began to suspect that Kerren's vendetta was not just about enforcing arbitrary rules. It was about asserting her personal power, an overreach that extended far beyond the bounds of the HOA's intended purpose. The fine, the inspections, and the barrage of anonymous complaints were all part of a calculated campaign to break his spirit. Inside the pristine white-walled corridors of the HOA office, Kerren reveled in her power. Every phone call, every dispatch of an inspector, every bureaucratic maneuver was a declaration. She was in charge, and she would not tolerate any deviation from her strict vision of community order. But as Kerren flexed her authority, Ethan's resolve only hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his right to enjoy his home. He was challenging an entire system built on outdated, draconian rules. By the end of the day, it was clear that Kerren's first power move had set the stage for a broader battle, a struggle that pitted the sanctity of personal freedom against the oppressive might of an overzealous HOA. And while Kerren was confident in her ability to enforce conformity, Ethan's quiet determination and unwavering belief in justice hinted that this was only the beginning of a long, hard-fought battle. Ethan's growing suspicions about the HOA's inner workings were soon confirmed. It wasn't just a matter of isolated fines or arbitrary inspections. There was a pattern of deliberate intimidation. Late one evening, as Ethan reviewed the mounting evidence on his cluttered desk, a timid knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A soft-spoken neighbor, Maria, stepped inside, her eyes filled with equal parts fear and resignation. "Ethan," she whispered, "there's something you need to know about Kerren and the board." Over a cup of lukewarm coffee in the dim light of his study, Maria revealed what had been whispered behind closed doors. Neighbors, once proud to call the community home, spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious disappearance of fines from the HOA's coffers whenever a significant donation was made to a community fund. Some even hinted that Kerren had been diverting funds for personal use. Luxurious dinners, trips to faraway resorts, and other extravagances that had no place in an organization meant to serve the community. Fueled by this information, Ethan decided it was time to dig deeper. He began a methodical investigation into the HOA's finances, accessing public records and quietly talking to other residents who had encountered the mysterious fines. What emerged was a picture of systemic corruption. Several board members, initially content to follow Kerren's lead, had started to question the legitimacy of her actions. One particularly sympathetic board member, who preferred to remain anonymous, discreetly handed Ethan a file containing emails, bank statements, and internal memos suggesting that Kerren was using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses. Armed with this damning evidence, Ethan set up hidden cameras along the periphery of his property. He documented every interaction, the furtive glances exchanged by board members during HOA meetings, the hushed phone conversations between Kerren and her aides, and even the staged inspections that now reeked of orchestration. Each video clip, each snapshot, became another brick in the mounting wall of evidence against a crooked system. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the community shifted. What had once been a neighborhood of friendly greetings and shared barbecues was now a stage for quiet rebellion. Homeowners began to question the authority of the HOA, wondering how long they would tolerate a leadership that seemed bent solely on personal gain and arbitrary punishment. Rumors spread like wildfire, and even those who had been cautious now found their voices. In one particularly tense board meeting, Ethan, armed with his compiled evidence, confronted Kerren in front of the assembled board members and a growing audience of concerned residents. His voice was calm but resonant. "I have documented not just your arbitrary fines, but also the misuse of funds that were meant to benefit all of us." The room fell into a heavy silence as board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, cracks appeared in the veneer of Kerren's invincibility. Yet, even as some board members nodded in reluctant agreement, Kerren's defiant glare told a story of desperation. "You think you can undermine the rules I've set," she spat, her tone oscillating between anger and disbelief. But it was too late. With each piece of evidence Ethan presented, the community's trust in Kerren and the HOA's legitimacy eroded further. The stakes had risen dramatically. Ethan wasn't just defending his property rights. He was exposing a network of corruption that had long been hidden behind smiles at community picnics and annual HOA dues. His quiet determination had ignited a spark of resistance, one that threatened to upend the established order. And though Kerren's tactics grew ever more erratic, the wheels of justice had been set in motion. In the midst of this growing turmoil, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. The battle was no longer confined to fines and formal complaints. It had become a fight for the soul of the community. Each piece of evidence, each brave testimony from a neighbor, strengthened his resolve. The HOA's abuses were on full display, and the community was finally beginning to wake up to the reality of living under a tyrant's thumb. As the heat of conflict escalated, Kerren began testing the limits of her power. One chilly morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of machinery rumbling outside. Rushing to his window, he saw his driveway being inexplicably excavated. Heavy-duty equipment rumbled through his once pristine front yard as workers, acting on what Kerren termed community improvement directives, dug up the foundation of his personal space. The audacity was staggering. Kerren defended the invasion as nothing more than an urgent project to expand sidewalks for the community's benefit. But to Ethan, it was a blatant violation of property rights, a desperate move to send a message that defiance would not be tolerated. Incensed but composed, Ethan raced to gather every scrap of evidence he could find: photos of the unannounced work, recordings of Kerren's dismissive remarks, and statements from a couple of shocked neighbors who witnessed the event. Later that day, at a hastily convened HOA meeting, Ethan strode into the room carrying a thick file of legal documents and photographs. The meeting hall, usually filled with a murmur of polite conversation, fell silent as he began his presentation. I have here clear evidence that not only are the funds misappropriated, but that this so-called expansion project was executed without any municipal approval, he declared, his voice echoing through the room. As he laid out the facts, community members exchanged incredulous looks, many of them visibly shaking their heads in disbelief. Kerren, who had always relied on bluster and technicalities, found herself cornered. The board members, now armed with tangible evidence, started questioning her decisions in ways they had never dared before. "This is not a community project, it's a personal vendetta," one board member murmured, while another demanded to see the permits that justified such a drastic measure. As tensions mounted, Ethan made his next move, a public confrontation that would irrevocably change the course of the HOA's tyranny. He arranged a town hall meeting at the local community center, inviting every homeowner to witness the truth. The turnout was overwhelming. Families, retirees, and young professionals all gathered in the packed hall, united by the shared frustration of living under Kerren's arbitrary rule. Standing at the podium, Ethan laid out the case in meticulous detail. "We are not living in a community governed by our elected officials or by the rule of law," he stated passionately. "We are at the mercy of an individual who has turned this association into a tool for her personal ambition." His words resonated through the room, striking a chord with every resident who had ever felt powerless against the imposition of rules that made little sense. The meeting became a turning point. Fueled by the undeniable proof of corruption and overreach, community members began voicing their support for change. Several residents shared their own stories of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. The collective outcry was such that even some board members, previously complicit or silent, openly questioned Kerren's leadership and her motives. Kerren's face, once an unyielding mask of authority, now showed the strain of being challenged by a unified community. She attempted to interject, citing obscure regulations and threatening further legal action, but her words fell flat against the rising tide of public sentiment. The momentum had shifted, and it was clear that the HOA's overreach had become too blatant to ignore. In a dramatic display of civic engagement, Ethan announced that he had filed for legal action against the HOA, citing not only the illegal excavation of his property, but also the systematic abuse of power. His decision galvanized the residents even further, with several people stepping forward to offer their support and resources. The community, once divided by fear and apathy, was now united in a cause that transcended individual grievances. That day, as the meeting adjourned amid a flurry of determined whispers and exchanged contact information, Kerren was left to confront the reality that her hold on the neighborhood was crumbling. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the future of the HOA and of every homeowner's right to live freely and securely in their own space. Determined to regain control, Kerren resorted to ever more desperate tactics. Late one rainy evening, as dark clouds gathered overhead, she made a final, reckless bid to intimidate Ethan. With trembling determination hidden beneath a veneer of authority, she contacted the local police, falsely reporting that Ethan's extravagant porch lighting constituted a public disturbance that endangered neighborhood safety. The claim was absurd, but in Kerren's eyes, desperate times called for desperate measures. When the police arrived, Ethan calmly greeted the officers from behind his door. Flashing his city official badge, he calmly explained that his lighting was fully compliant with municipal regulations, and that Kerren's complaint was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to harass him. The officers, already weary from prior fruitless calls, exchanged skeptical glances. Kerren's voice shrieked from the other side of the door, accusing Ethan of endangering the community and insisting that the rules be followed at any cost. But even as Kerren raged on, the sound of crunching gravel and furtive movement on security footage told another story. That very night, Ethan's newly installed cameras captured an unsettling scene. A dark figure, later identified as a private investigator hired by Kerren, stealthily creeping around the perimeter of Ethan's garage. The footage revealed an unmistakable breach of privacy, a blatant trespass that cemented Kerren's illegal actions. The next morning, the evidence was public. Ethan wasted no time and showcased the incriminating footage at the next HOA meeting. The room was filled with gasps and murmurs of disbelief as neighbors witnessed the unmasking of Kerren's secret weapon. This, Ethan declared, is proof that when the rules aren't obeyed by those in power, no one is safe. The collective shock was palpable, and for the first time, even the most staunch supporters of the HOA began to question the legitimacy of Kerren's actions. Angered and cornered, Kerren scrambled to salvage her reputation. In a desperate bid to reclaim control, she attempted to initiate a new round of legal threats and public admonishments. Yet, her efforts only served to further expose the extent of her desperation. Her phone calls became frantic, her directives muddled, and it was clear that the HOA's carefully constructed image of authority was now riddled with cracks. In a moment of unguarded vulnerability, one of Kerren's closest aides confided in a resident that even within the inner circle, doubts were mounting. "I never believed any of this would go so far," the aide admitted in hushed tones. "Now, it seems like we're all paying the price for her unchecked power." This revelation only fanned the flames of public outrage. It wasn't long before word spread that Kerren's private investigator had been caught on camera, that her legal threats were baseless, and that her tactics were more reminiscent of a schoolyard bully than a responsible community leader. At the next community forum, the atmosphere was electric. Residents, emboldened by the undeniable proof of Kerren's illegal behavior, demanded accountability. Ethan, standing at the center of the uproar, summarized the situation in a few pointed words. "When you abuse power for personal gain, justice always finds a way." His statement was met with thunderous applause, a clear signal that Kerren's final, desperate move had sealed her fate. As the meeting drew to a close, it was evident that the residents had taken a stand. Kerren's attempts to drag Ethan into another round of legal disputes had only hastened her own downfall. The community was now united against her, determined to restore fairness and transparency to the HOA. And as Kerren's face turned ashen with the realization that her control was slipping away, it became clear that there was no turning back. The mounting public outrage and the incontrovertible evidence against Kerren catalyzed a dramatic shift in power. In an unprecedented move, the community held a special vote, a direct challenge to the long-held dominance of the HOA under Kerren's rule. In a packed community hall, illuminated by the soft glow of twilight streaming through tall windows, residents gathered to cast their ballots. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, each vote a quiet defiance against years of arbitrary oppression. When the results were tallied, the outcome was as clear as it was resounding. Kerren had lost the confidence of the community. The vote was not just a rejection of her policies. It was a repudiation of a system that had abused its authority for far too long. Within hours, a flurry of official announcements followed. The city, alarmed by the scale of the community's discontent, initiated a full-scale investigation into the HOA's financial mismanagement and illegal practices. Kerren's once impregnable position began to crumble. The evidence that Ethan had painstakingly compiled was now being examined by state authorities, and her actions were under intense scrutiny. In a matter of days, the very organization she had built on fear and intimidation became the subject of legal sanctions. The HOA was fined for enforcing rules that had no legal basis, and several board members found themselves facing charges related to the misuse of funds. For Ethan, this victory was bittersweet, a triumph born out of long, hard-fought battles and countless sleepless nights spent gathering evidence. As he sipped his morning coffee on the sunlit porch, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The community had reclaimed its voice, and with Kerren's downfall, a fresh era of fairness and transparency was beginning. Neighbors who once cowered in silence now exchanged relieved smiles, and the oppressive shadow that had loomed over the neighborhood was finally lifting. Kerren, on the other hand, was left with nothing but public humiliation and the crumbling ruins of her authority. Press headlines soon carried the story. HOA tyrant ousted. Community demands accountability. Her personal residence, once a symbol of her self-appointed power, was hastily put on the market, a final reminder of her rapid decline from grace. The city's investigation was comprehensive, leaving no stone unturned. And it wasn't long before the full extent of the corruption was laid bare for all to see. In the wake of the scandal, several board members, who had once been complicit in Kerren's schemes, were either dismissed or faced legal repercussions. The HOA itself was forced into a complete restructuring, one that prioritized transparency and community input over the heavy-handed, dictatorial style of its past. The downfall of Kerren and the disintegration of the old regime became a case study in civic empowerment, a reminder that when residents unite, even the most entrenched systems of power can be overthrown. As Kerren's fate was sealed and the HOA crumbled around her, Ethan stood as a symbol of justice and resilience. His unwavering commitment to the truth had not only preserved his personal sanctuary, but it sparked a movement that would change the neighborhood forever. And as the community began to rebuild, the legacy of Kerren's tyranny became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. In the aftermath of the upheaval, the legal repercussions for the HOA were swift and unrelenting. The state's Consumer Protection Agency had launched a full investigation into the association's practices. After weeks of hearings and evidence review, the agency fined the HOA for the illegal enforcement of non-existent rules and for the misappropriation of funds. Several board members, who had turned a blind eye to Kerren's abuses, found themselves under fire for their complicity. Ethan played a pivotal role in the legal battle. Using his collected evidence, he not only testified before local authorities, but also helped organize a class action lawsuit on behalf of the affected homeowners. His efforts exposed a deeply flawed system, one that prioritized personal vendettas over community welfare, and brought to light a host of legal violations that had gone unchecked for years. The legal process was arduous, with public hearings that laid bare the extent of the HOA's corruption. The final verdict was a landmark decision. The HOA was forced to pay significant fines, and the board was restructured to ensure greater oversight and transparency. For many residents, it was the long-awaited vindication of years of quiet suffering. And for Ethan, it was a triumphant final power move, a testament to the power of perseverance and community solidarity. With the legal case closed and the HOA in disarray, Kerren's personal life began to unravel as spectacularly as her public persona. Public humiliation became her constant companion. Once known as the unyielding HOA Kerren, she was now the subject of bitter gossip and endless ridicule. Her once proud facade had crumbled, revealing the desperation and incompetence beneath. Unable to withstand the mounting pressure, Kerren was forced to resign from her position. Her home, long a symbol of her self-aggrandizement, was put on the market in a rapid, unceremonious sale. Rumors spread that even her personal assets were being seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a cruel twist of fate, Kerren found herself isolated from the very community she had tried so hard to control. Former allies distanced themselves, and even some of her closest friends expressed regret over having supported her misguided reign. In a moment of poetic justice, Ethan later encountered Kerren at a new job, ironically, as an assistant property manager for another HOA. With a quiet smile and a gentle shake of his head, he remarked, "I hope you like following the rules." The comment, delivered in a tone that mingled amusement with finality, encapsulated the downfall of a woman who had once wielded power with reckless abandon. The neighborhood, now free from the oppressive grip of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections, settled into a new rhythm, a quieter, freer pace that celebrated individual expression and mutual respect. Neighbors reconnected over community potlucks, and the annual HOA meeting was transformed into an open forum for genuine dialogue, rather than a stage for authoritarian decrees. Ethan often found himself on his favorite porch, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, reflecting on how far the community had come. What began as a personal battle for his home had evolved into a profound lesson in civic duty and empowerment. A single act of defiance had rippled outward, inspiring countless others to stand up for their rights. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan relaxed in his favorite rocking chair, a neighbor strolled by, grinning mischievously, and handed him a mock HOA violation notice for having excessive good vibes. Ethan chuckled, the sound mingling with the laughter of nearby children and the hum of everyday life reclaiming its normalcy. They really tried, he mused softly to himself, savoring the poetic justice that had been served. As the final chapter of the turbulent saga closed, the community embraced its newfound freedom. The legacy of Kerren's tyranny was now nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder that true power lies in the unity and resilience of a community that refuses to be bullied. Fade to black.